This is the Pearls and Swine podcast, giving hope and healing to those who are under toxic leadership, whether that's in the home or in the workplace. Jacob was one of my first interviewees for this blog a number of years ago, and I posted his story quite a while ago, but I'm just now getting to doing the podcast of it. Jacob simply described his pastor as a narcissist to me, but it took much longer for him to describe all the destruction wrought by his senior pastor while Jacob served the burgeoning church plant. Jacob had studied for 2 years in college before he and his wife joined a church that had been a church plant, but was now ruled by an elder board. The pastor, who was an excellent speaker, had planted the church, and he had been effective in ministering to its members through his pulpit ministry. When he and his wife joined, Jacob was determined to be an encouragement to the pastor, knowing that often pastors have no one to go to for help and encouragement. They struck up a seemingly close relationship, and within 6 months, Jacob was asked to come on staff as the executive ministry director and also serve as an elder on the board. He brought much organization to the young church, and the growth in the following 12 to 18 months was stunning. The school cafeteria in which they were meeting was filling up. However, Jacob was sensing what he interpreted to be an apparent consequence of the rapid growth, a lack of shepherding on the part of the leadership. Jacob said he started a conversation about it, but the pastor was increasingly focused on gathering people around himself to hear him preach, Jacob said. It was getting to be unhealthy. He believed the purpose of church leadership to be the Ephesians 4 model of training the members for the works of ministry, not gathering them to hear one uniquely gifted teacher. Jacob determined to discuss the issue with the pastor in a non-judgmental way, something Jacob considers his modus operandi when confronting. Having grown up in an abusive home, he was particularly sensitive to being wrong. He was quick to take the log out of his own eye, as Jesus in Matthew 7 instructs. He was not prepared for the pastor's manipulation. Jacob described his reactions as narcissistic. He immediately shifted the blame to Jacob. The confrontations came like clockwork. Every 3 or 4 months, Jacob would sense that he was responsible before God to encourage the pastor to get off his high horse and shepherd the congregation rather than bask in his own growing fame. Never once did the pastor admit fault, according to Jacob. He would ask the pastor to consider what he had said, whether it was valid or not, and the pastor said he would. But the pastor's response was always half-hearted, and he was never very convincing. Jacob described the church as being in a very wealthy area and had several millionaires in the congregation. It appeared to Jacob that the pastor would drop whatever he was doing and visit a wealthy member when he was called upon. However, when someone less affluent or less influential sought counseling from the pastor, he would schedule them 2 or 3 weeks out. Jacob remembers a young couple who was just married having marital struggles of a serious nature. They asked for an appointment with the pastor. The pastor scheduled them for 2 weeks later. However, a woman who was wealthy, attractive, and good friends with an influential pastor in their denomination asked for an appointment to discuss some of the well-known pastor's teaching. She was immediately given a hearing at her home with just the 2 of them there. An older couple was having marital difficulties and ended up calling Jacob to come counsel them. Jacob recalls physically shaking on the way to their house, knowing he was much younger than they were and had very little experience in counseling. He was convinced it was not for him to be in this position, but knew the pastor would not meet with them. It ended well, and years later, the couple claimed he saved their marriage. But Jacob was angered by the shepherding failure of the pastor that was not getting any better. The pastor's self-centeredness was also apparent in his handling of the church's money. He hired a personal assistant, paying him $40,000 without elder approval. He gave himself a $10,000 raise without elder approval. He signed himself up for a medical plan that cost $5,000 without elder approval. And when the church purchased office space, the pastor spent $20,000 on the remodeling. Guess what? Without elder approval. According to Jacob, the building had a luxurious office for the pastor and a long countertop along one wall for the 5 other staff members. The fact that he and the other staff members had a countertop did not really bother him. He was happy with his countertop office. But it was a glaring representation of the pastor's heart that drove Jacob to speak with him about it. The pastor, in response, suggested Jacob take over the kitchen space for his office. Jacob told him that was not the point. It was getting to the point where Jacob did not trust the pastor. He said it was almost like he was hijacking God's truth for his gain. He explained that he would sit under the pastor's sermon and realize he did not trust him. Pastor did not have his best interests at heart. Jacob tried to keep his head down and do ministry. But though he received great encouragement from the elders and congregant members when he would periodically preach or teach, the pastor would pull him aside and make him feel like he had totally failed and was the worst preacher ever. Jacob found out later that when people would ask the pastor for Jacob to teach a Sunday school class, the pastor would tell them Jacob had personal problems and doctrinal issues. Jacob believed the pastor was jealous and afraid of anyone else in the church that was gifted. He could not stand to see anyone else in the congregation celebrated. He knew at some point he would be cut off. When the pastor told Jacob he was firing him, he said he could remain on as an elder. The pastor wrote a letter to the elder board explaining, Jacob has acknowledged his faults. Jacob was abusive to me. He was so oppressive to me. It was not at all what had passed between them. When Jacob met with the elders, they were very encouraging to him and asked what he wanted to say to the congregation. Jacob said he didn't want to control it. Later, the elder sent a draft of the letter to Jacob. Apparently, the draft was quite different than what was read to the congregation. Following the congregational meeting, a senior member called him and said Jacob was trashed at the meeting. The member was very disappointed. The elders had said just enough to raise suspicions, but did not raise a single failing of Jacob's. They gave him a good severance that Jacob interpreted to be buying him off, being that they had not actually raised any issues with his work with the church. Jacob explained to me, this felt well beyond circumstantial difficulty. It felt like spiritual warfare against my soul, like a deliberate attack against the deepest part of who I am. It is hard to describe the level of woundedness I experienced. Like others with whom I have spoken, he said one of the hardest things to face besides the death of a loved one is betrayal. He said he was ready for the pastor to act in unbecoming ways, but not the elders. He was not prepared to see them manipulated as weak men by the pastor. When it happened, something snapped. He said it has taken a long time to overcome. When asked what was most healing to Jacob, he mentioned to me time and God's sovereignty. Of particular interest was his struggle with God's sovereignty in the situation. He explained to me that knowing God is sovereign was both a barrier and a ground for healing. It was a barrier because God has brought this upon me so that he must be displeased with me and bringing discipline. An easy interpretation for any of us, let alone one who has been raised being told he is worthless and always wrong. He says, my disposition is to believe others don't care about me. I know it's not true. It is an ever-present lie. I was force-fitted as a child. On the other hand, the knowledge of God's sovereignty also meant to Jacob, if God wounds me, it's because he loves me. And if he heals, it's because he loves me. He has popped back and forth between these views, knowing all the while God loves him dearly, and the first interpretation is not biblical. He takes great comfort in this self-talk based upon the truth of God's word. Following a year working as a barista and working towards an undergraduate degree, Jacob moved across country to attend seminary. He had not preached from a pulpit since leaving the church. Within a week of arriving, he was asked by the president of the seminary to fill in for a retreat speaker at a nearby Christian camp. The speaker had become ill and was unable to attend. Jacob was given the task of preparing a sermon and a devotional each day for the retreat on very short notice. Rather than an overwhelming experience, he said he felt the Lord was saying to him, despite his experience, I trust you to handle my word. I did not discard you. It was healing to know that the Lord had more for him than what a narcissistic senior pastor had sought to impress upon him. Jacob still struggles with the insecurities common in my research to those who have been under abusive leaders. There's a palatable sense of self-doubt that accompanies the trauma from such abuse. I have yet to meet someone who is self-differentiated enough to remain free of the harm. It is what drives me to encourage those under abusive leadership to get out. The long-term impact I have seen is not worth manning up. Jacob has told his story to others and faced the disapproval of those who do not understand abuse. When I first asked him to share his story, he shared some hesitancy. He explained, my wife and I have learned the hard way to be much more cautious in choosing to share our experience and the insights we have gleaned. On multiple occasions, my willingness to be vulnerable has resulted later in others immaturely attempting to use my vulnerability to their own advantage by assuming that these experiences somehow encumber my abilities in some way, something like making me seem like damaged goods. Needless to say, this has been very hurtful, but alas, we are broken people who live in a broken world. Even as Jacob came before a group of elders to be taken under the care of a denominational conference in preparation for ordination, he was fearful. He struggled to determine if the telling of his story would create backlash. I hope and I pray that the bride of Christ to which he wishes to minister will in turn minister to him as he continues to experience God's gracious love and healing. And I want to add finally to this, because since that time he had graduated from seminary and had gotten a pastorate on the East Coast, and he's doing very, very well as I have last heard. Thank you for listening to the Pearls and Swine podcast. We seek to bring hope and healing to those under toxic leadership, whether in the home, the church, or the workplace. If you find our podcasts and blogs helpful, consider giving to the costs of production. My name is Kelly Dainert, and I produce the podcast. The music you heard is called Finally, a song I wrote a number of years ago. It is performed by Mingoli, an African ensemble from Malawi.